You're watching the video titled Managing Storage with Power CLI. This is a part of the VMware vSphere Power CLI training video course. In this lesson, first we're going to go into an overview of the different parts of storage in vSphere. I've titled that From Host to Data Store Journey. Then we're going to go into a list of all of the commandlets. I'll show you the different types, the nouns, the verbs. And then we're going to work with the storage subsystem. I'm going to show you how to configure iSCSI using Power CLI. We'll work with disks, LUNs, and partitions. LUN would be a logical unit number. I'm going to show you how to manage your data stores using Power CLI. And then I'm going to show you how to use the data store provider. So what I want to show you about storage is how complex it is, how many different pieces there are in vSphere. Before I go into the slides, actually, let me bring up my vSphere client. Okay, there's a few different avenues into which you can see your storage. You've got, when you've got a host highlighted and on the configuration tab, you have two different views here, storage adapters and storage. And then additionally, you've got a data stores view. All of these are related. We're going to be going into where the Power CLI commandlets tie into all three of these different areas. Starting with the host. As I go through this slide and the next slide, I'm going to show you some examples of a couple of commandlets which fit into certain categories. And the first instance is going to be get VM host. We've talked about this one before. This is nothing new. And this is all about showing you the relationship. When you are working with storage, you start with the host, and then the host has a storage subsystem. This is just talking about the software contained within vSphere, which interfaces with the next piece of the puzzle. The first example commandlet for this is going to be get VM host storage. Then we have the HBAs, the host bus adapters, and these are the storage adapters. This is talking about the physical card that is within a physical server that's linked to the next piece in the chain. An example of working with a host bus adapter would be the get VM host HBA commandlet. And that next link in the chain would be your protocol. That could be SCSI, it could be iSCSI, it could be fiber channel. And if you've got commandlets to work with that, such as, for example, get iSCSI HBA target. Continuing on, next we have the SCSI LUN. SCSI, of course, is a data storage protocol which you are probably familiar with, but the LUN is a term, depending on how steeped you are in storage, you might not be as familiar with that. LUN stands for logical unit number, and this is basically a single resource in a SCSI device. It could be SCSI, it could be iSCSI, it could be fiber channel. Several different protocols use this same notation. And there's a couple of commandlets working with those. We have get SCSI LUN and get SCSI LUN path. Next in the chain is the physical disk. So we have behind the LUN, which is presented by your storage array or your network attached storage or your RAID array, you've got physical disks inside of that. And there are commandlets for working with those, for example, such as get VM host disk. And almost done with this, we've got a VMFS partition. So this is the primary type of partition which you're going to be working with when talking about storage in VMware. It's not the only one, but it's definitely the native one. And this is 99% of the time where your virtual machines and the virtual machine disk files are going to be stored. And you have commandlets such as get VM host disk partition for working with your VMFS partitions. And lastly, we have the logical disk. This is I guess you could say it's the highest level of abstraction for storage. And we have commandlets such as get data store for working with these. Data store, of course, is by the time you get to the end of this chain of the storage that I've been talking about, the data store is where your virtual machines go. Now I'm going to be showing you an overview of all the different commandlets available for working with storage in vSphere. There are at least 20 that we're going to be talking about today that cover a wide range of storage-related topics. I've shown you some of the different categories that those fall into. Let's get a little more specific as to some of the names. In addition to the commandlets, there's actually a provider that you can use to navigate data store file systems in your PowerShell. Now, I will explain in more detail what a provider is. For now, just suffice to say that it is a way that you can look at your data store as a hierarchical file system at the command line, just like you would your C drive. Some of the commandlet nouns that we're going to be talking about are vmhost storage, vmhost HBA, which is a host bus adapter, iSCSI HBA target, SCSI LUN path, vmhost disk, and vmhost disk partition. And there are a couple more here not included in this list. First, let's talk about the storage subsystem. In the screenshot on the screen here, you can see that I've got the storage item selected under the configuration tab. This is where we're going to be working with the storage subsystem. There's several different layers, what we're going to be talking about. I'll show you what I mean. And there's a lot of functionality in here. One example here is the get vmhost storage commandlet. There's a help screen for that. Okay, the commandlets that we're going to be talking about. Get vmhost storage. This one is used to retrieve information about your host storage subsystem. You can also use it to rescan for VMFS volumes and rescan all host bus adapters. These two things are important. Whenever you make a storage change on your back end, whether it's a fiber channel disks that you've zoned a new LUN, or you have created a new NFS mount, or added a new physical disk to a host server, there's several different scenarios where you'll need to perform a rescan operation. And I'm going to show you how to do that programmatically here in just a moment. You can also use the set vmhost storage commandlet to enable or disable support for software iSCSI. So iSCSI, in case you've not worked with that much before, this is like SCSI, like the wire protocol used for transferring disk commands back and forth to a SCSI hard drive, except that it goes over an IP network. So that is something you can put over a gigabit or even a 10 gigabit Ethernet network and provide adequate, depending on your needs, an adequate level of performance for a networked file system. So you can use iSCSI instead of Fiber Channel to store your virtual machines. And I can show you how we can use the software iSCSI stack built into VMware in order to access some of those resources. Let's go straight into a demo, and I'm going to be talking you through rescanning host bus adapters. Okay, we've got my shell up here. Let's check out these commandlets. So I type git command star vmhost storage. That star, of course, is a wildcard. It's going to show me the commandlets here that end in vmhost storage. So let's type in get vmhost storage by itself. Doesn't work. Value cannot be found for the mandatory parameter vmhost. So let's start off with a get vmhost, pipe it to get vmhost storage, and I'm going to hit enter. What we see come back is very simple, not a whole lot to it. Let's do this again and pipe it to format list and see if there's anything more behind the scenes there. Okay, so we do have more detail. The software iSCSI enabled property is one that you could see in the view above here. So this is basically saying whether or not your software iSCSI stack is on or off. And we've got a property with the name of the VM host there. We have information about some of the volumes, which we'll talk about in different ways to get some of these same details. So there's a SCSI LUN property, and that's basically all the other interesting things here that I want to talk about. In fact, we're going to be talking about SCSI LUN commandlets, which are perhaps a more convenient in some ways method of working with this data here. So I'm not going to examine that right now. But what's more important is I want to show you what other parameters there are on the get vmhost storage commandlet. So let's go up here And let's examine. Okay, so we've got refresh, rescan all HBAs, and rescan VMFS. Before I do those, let me show you what they correspond to in the vSphere client. So it's right here on the screen. You can see here, here's refresh and rescan all. If I click on rescan all, we've got check boxes for both scan for new storage devices and scan for new VMFS volumes. So these precisely align to the two options of which I showed you here, rescan all HBA and rescan VMFS. So if you are unsure of what these things do, here's the help description right here. So a very common thing to do is to rescan for new VMFS volumes, and the default here was that they were both checked. So we'll just do that same thing here. Note here that says rescanning all adapters can be slow. The second option is going to be quicker than leaving both of those boxes checked. It says here this is faster than scanning for new storage. So what I'm going to do is to pretend that I was in a situation where, for example, I zoned a new disk for the VM host servers here so that I could add storage to my vSphere environment. So this is something that maybe you work on, maybe someone you've got a separate storage team, and they do the work to provision that storage. Long story short, you've got to rescan the host bus adapter in order to be able to see it. So let me show you how to do that real quick. It's actually quite easy. So I'm just hitting up arrow a couple times until I get back to my previous command. I'm just going to say rescan all HBA, and I'll add the other one as well. Rescan VMFS, and hit enter, and you will see it progress. For some reason, VMware didn't create a run asynchronously parameter on this commandlet, so you do have to wait for it to finish before you can continue. And it's done now, so let's look back at our VI client, and you can see there, rescan VMFS, rescan all HBAs. So that was pretty handily done. Before we go back to the slides, I do want to mention, at the very least in passing, the set vmhost storage commandlet. And before I do that, let me do this. We're going to say $S equals get vmhost piped to get vmhost storage, and that's going to give me a little handle that I can refer back to quickly. So I can pass this to, for example, set vmhost storage. Okay, so there were easier ways to have typed that. Okay, there we go. And once having done that, you can do, for example, software iSCSI enabled true or false. I'm just going to set it to true here real quick. So that operation is basically the only thing that you can do with the set vmhost storage commandlet. And I don't know if this is something that VMware intends to enhance, but in the case right now, that's what you can do. It has the one function and one function only. So let's go back to the slides. Now we're going to talk about the vmhost HBA commandlets, and HBA stands for Host Bus Adapter. First up is the get vmhost HBA commandlet. This one is used for retrieving information about all your host bus adapters, and you could have multiple different types of HBAs, from fiber channel, iSCSI, SCSI, or SATA. And in fact, there's a couple other things that sneak in there, such as your local CD-ROM drives. You can also filter by device name or type, and I'll show you examples of that in a moment. There's also the set vmhost HBA commandlet, and the naming of this one is a little bit of a misnomer. It's primarily used to modify iSCSI settings. It's not very generalized, so you can't change many settings that are related to, for example, a fiber channel adapter. There are other things that we'll be talking about related to iSCSI, so I'm just going to talk mostly about get vmhost HBA for the moment, and I'll show you a demonstration of that right now. So I've got my shell up now, and you can see here I have the help open for the get vmhost HBA commandlet. And there's not a whole lot to it. We have a VM host parameter, we have a device parameter, and a type parameter, as well as the standard server and the rest of the common parameters that PowerShell ships with all commandlets. So the only two here that really need to be explained are device and type. So first, let me run this. Let's type get vmhost HBA by itself. And it looks like it actually returned information about all of the host servers to which I am connected right now. So you can see here that we've got a device column, type, model, and status. This first column, device, this is referring to the logical name that the console operating system or vSphere, ESX, sees the host bus adapter as. So for example, we've got VM HBA 0, 1, 32, 33, and so on. And if you've worked with storage for a while, you'll know these pretty well because these are in fact, I'll show you in the vSphere client. Under storage adapters, you can see them here. Here is the VM HBA 33, 0, 32, so on and so forth. Let's go back over to our shell. Type, we've got several different here, block, parallel SCSI, here's an iSCSI, and you can see a description here, and a status which set to unknown. That's not a real helpful status. So let's do get vmhost HBA again. I'm going to assign it to a variable, and type get HBA and pipe that to format list, and see what we see. Okay, a lot of different stuff scrolled by. I'm going to filter this down a little bit. In fact, let's go back to get vmhost HBA, and let's look at type. Now, if I type an invalid value for type and hit enter, you can see here that it tells me one of the valid values that it will accept are block, fiber channel, iSCSI, and parallel SCSI. So let's do get vmhost HBA dash type, and then let's just try block. And you will see that come back. It's got 4 things there. And if I type iSCSI, I should get 1 back, or 2. Okay, so it's the adapters. I have 2 servers, 2 adapters, so 2 iSCSI host bus adapters. So let's do this. We're going to take this, assign that to a variable, and then we're going to assign the blocks to a variable as well. And I will show you what they look like. They do look different. Pipe the block devices to format list, and let's check them out. So we have the device name here as the first column, a few different various identification fields which aren't extremely important in context of what I'm going to be explaining to you. We have a PCI address, driver, this one could be interesting, bus, host ID, VM host, so that's the host name right there. So that's not very useful, status field, and then the type again. And let's see, if I scroll down a little bit, I do see one that has a SCSI-LUN UID present here. And that's most of the information that we have. So let's look, however, at the iSCSI devices that I pulled out. So let's look at $is, pipe that to format list. And we have different types of information. Let me scroll up to the top here. And you can see here that we have a field called authentication capability. And I'll explore this one in more detail in just a moment. But let me read down some of the rest of these. Authentication properties, it says chip discouraged. Current speed, iSCSI name. If you've worked with iSCSI before, you will recognize this sort of address. Is iSCSI software based, yes or no? And further detail about the iSCSI software adapter. If you have for example, a certain type of iSCSI hardware adapter, you might see that present and it would say software based is false. But in my case, I'm working with the iSCSI software stack built into vSphere, so it says true. So let's take a look at the authentication capability field. You can see some further detail in here. A little bit hard to read, so what I'm going to do is $is. I'm going to index into this collection and grab the first item. There it is. And we'll say authentication. See, the full name is authentication capability. So let me copy that there, paste it here, and hit enter. Okay, now you can see some information about iSCSI. Let me show you where this comes from in the vSphere client. So I've got my screen coming up here under storage adapters, and I have several of them. The first in my list here is iSCSI, and there's a properties box right here. If I click on it, now I'm starting to see some of the same detail. You recall here's this IQN number, and we have some detail about CHAP, which stands for Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol. That's just a method used for authenticating between your iSCSI server and your iSCSI client. Now, they don't actually use, with iSCSI, they don't use the word server and client. They use the terms target and initiator. And you can see here it says initiator right there, target right here. So this is, let me see if I can find some of the further detail that corresponds. Okay, so here is the checkbox whether iSCSI, software iSCSI is enabled or disabled. That's that box there that I showed you with the set vmhost storage commandlet. So let's go back out to our shell. And you can see some of the property names here correspond to some of the checkboxes and settings in the iSCSI properties, which I just showed you in the vSphere client, such as mutual CHAP or Kerberos CHAP, and there's a couple of other here options, target CHAP, target mutual CHAP. So this is basically just showing you whether these things are enabled or disabled. However, it won't let you modify them here. So I've just piped this property through getMember, which is a PowerShell command alias, to GM here. And if I scroll down to these properties, you can see here where it says get. So this is just showing to me that while I can see the information contained here about, for example, mutual CHAP, if I scroll down to mutual CHAP here, well, not a great example because I can't read it. Let's look at CHAP. If I scroll down to CHAP over here, you can see it says get. So that means that I can view this property, but I can't modify it. So just taking that example slightly further, there's CHAP, it's equal to true. If I were to set it to false, it's not going to work. It's telling me it's a read-only property. So there are ways to modify this using PowerCLI, and we'll get to those shortly. Okay, now we're going to talk about how you can use PowerCLI to configure iSCSI. For example, here's a screenshot showing you some of the settings which I had shown to you just a minute ago, and we can access these using the iSCSI properties window in the vSphere client. I'm going to show you how using PowerCLI in commandlets such as, for example, new iSCSI HBA target, you can modify some of these settings. I will note that I'm not going to be able to instruct you in all of the specifics about iSCSI right here and now. That's kind of beyond the scope of this lesson. But obviously, there's a lot of settings to configure with iSCSI. It's a relatively complex protocol. So it's a good thing that it is accessible from PowerCLI because there are so many moving parts. Automating the configuration of your iSCSI stack is a pretty valuable thing to be able to do. So we'll start out with the set vmhost HBA commandlet, which I mentioned a couple slides ago. One of the things that you can use this commandlet to do is to modify your iSCSI initiator name. So this is sort of like, it's sort of analogous to a host name in an IP network. This is the client side piece. The initiator is the client that's asking for storage resources. And you can use the set vmhost HBA commandlet to change that name. You can also change settings for CHAP. And there's a lot of settings in there that you can manipulate. Some of the most important parameters in this commandlet are iSCSI HBA, and this is going to be something that I'll show you how to get it using the get vmhost HBA commandlet. Actually, we talked about that just a minute ago. There's iSCSI name, and that's how you would modify the initiator name. Then there's chap type, and it accepts 4 different options. You can see here: prohibited, discouraged, preferred, and required. And then we have chap name and chap password. And there's a few other settings here that I'll show to you in just a moment. So let's go right to the shell and check those out. So in a previous demo just a few minutes ago, we had created this variable is, which contains a reference back to my iSCSI host bus adapters on both of my vSphere servers. So let's check out how we can use the set vmhost HBA commandlet in order to modify some of the settings contained within these objects. So I explained some of the settings here just a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to go over those again. But what I am going to do is to show you, for example, the help on set vmhost HBA. This commandlet has several parameters, and it's used here. You can see configures the chap properties of the given iSCSI HBA. So as I mentioned before, even though the name of the noun here is vmhost HBA, which is a general sort of name, it's really not even messing around. We're only talking about iSCSI here. So some of the different parameters here, let's see, I talked to you about chap type and iSCSI name already. Chap name and chap password, mutual chap enabled, mutual chap name, all these things. Let me show you where these show up here. We're right here under configuration, storage adapters, and then properties. Okay, so we have the properties of the VM-HBA33 host bus adapter, and you can see here, for example, under chap, where we have these options which were, well, let me go back to you and show you on the screen. Here it is. Okay, chap type. The chap types are prohibited, discouraged, preferred, and required. They correspond to this box right here. Do not use chap, use chap, and then a couple of wishy-washy options here in the middle. Don't use chap unless you have to, and try not to use chap unless you really have to. So here are the settings that we're talking about changing, these chap settings here. And let me show you, go back to the shell. So we have our IS, and we have, let's see, set vmhost HBA. So what we can do is let's check out the chap type, the current chap type of my iSCSI adapters. And I have, okay, right here at the top, authentication properties, chap is discouraged. And if I scroll up and look at my first host, it says the same thing. Chap is discouraged. So it's not disabled, it's merely set to, and I'm going to bring my vSphere client back up here. It is set to do not use it unless it's required. So that is the same thing as discouraged. Going back to my shell. So let's change that setting. So let's do IS, pipe that to set vmhost HBA, chap type, and I'm just going to typo this, show you this again where it's prohibited, discouraged, preferred, required. So I'm going to set it to required. Chap password must be specified if chap authentication is enabled. So that's a not so subtle hint there. And you can see here how I can just hit tab to iterate through these. Now, I don't like setting passwords in the clear like this, because if you type a password into PowerShell like this, you could easily be, for example, saving your history out to a file. So this is a PowerShell tip rather than a PowerCLI tip. But for example, let me show you get history. And there's that password right there. And Some PowerShell shells will actually save your history to a file, and then now you've got this file, this plain text sitting in, in a file on your hard drive. So I tend to not like setting information like this. So you might want to research doing things like using the get credential commandlet. Now, unfortunately, the set vmhost HBA commandlet doesn't support PowerShell credentials in this way, so it's not a one-step process, so it's not something that I can easily demonstrate for you at the moment. But what you can do is you can set a credential object, test, hit enter. Now I've got a credential, and it has a password, but it's not easily obtained. And in fact, even when you look at the password, it's in a secure string, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there's cryptography protecting this in memory so that it's not it's non-trivial to access that. So definitely something to look into. So let's look at some of the other settings that we can change. I'm going to scroll up here a little bit. And in addition to chap name, chap password, we have iSCSI name. So I could use, if I needed to change the address, I could do that here. You can see here's my address. And that's changed right here. So I'm not going to change that because that could have adverse impacts on my lab environment. But if you were to use the iSCSI name parameter, and you could modify this pretty easily. And that's this parameter here, right here, iSCSI name. So let's get back to the slides. We're going to now talk about the iSCSI HBA target commandlets. An iSCSI target, if you've not worked with it before, this is a storage resource accessible over an IP network. So in this case, a target is basically a server. So we are going to be configuring the iSCSI initiator, which is the client-side piece, and this is a piece of software contained within the ESX server. We have a few commandlets I'm going to talk about. Get iSCSI HBA target. This is one that's used to retrieve the available iSCSI targets. New iSCSI target. This is used to create a connection to a new iSCSI target. And then we have remove to remove an existing iSCSI target, and set, which you can use to modify an existing iSCSI target. Let's focus a little bit more on the new iSCSI HBA target commandlet. This commandlet is used to create a connection to a new storage resource. We've got several important parameters. Some of them are going to be iSCSI HBA, which you can obtain one of these from the get vmhost HBA commandlet. I'll show you an example of how we do this again in a moment. Address, which is simply an IP address. Port, which you can leave it off, and that will default to 3260, which is part of the iSCSI protocol. And then we have type, which is static or send. Next thing to do is to show you a demonstration of how this works. So first I'm going to bring up the vSphere client and show you the analogous pieces within the client here. So I'm on one of my host servers, configuration, storage adapters. I've got my iSCSI adapter highlighted here. We go to properties. First thing I want to remind you about is the previous demonstration in the past couple of slides. We're dealing with this dialog box here, these chat properties, and these are the top level, if you will, settings, authentication settings for iSCSI. So this is the policy that is at the top, but you also have the iSCSI targets, which can have their own chat settings. So what we're basically talking about here are the ability to connect to multiple iSCSI servers, and each of them can have different authentication settings. So you've got two different types. We have dynamic and static. Dynamic, you can see here's an example of one that I've got set up. If I go to settings, basically the only options are the IP address and the port, and then we do have, as I mentioned, you've got some additional chat settings. It's the same type of setting. We just have the ability to use it or not, and specify a username and a password. And but basically, I've got these checked right now, which means that it's going to inherit those settings from the main iSCSI settings dialog box. If you go to static, you'll see that there's one additional field, and you can specify an iSCSI target name. So what this is doing is connecting to a certain iSCSI server, such as this IP address here, and then it is presenting just a certain specific resource name that we're dealing with. It's called target name, and that's something that you can specify it here, or if you're using dynamic discovery, you won't specify that iSCSI name. So anyway, this is the piece that we're talking about here with the iSCSI HBA target commandlets, and let me show you what those look like right now. Okay, I have my console up. Let's remind ourselves what we're working with. Get command star. Let's just do iSCSI HBA star, and we can see the 4 commandlets in question plus an additional thing that's just getting in the way, but no big deal. So let's just run iSCSI HBA target by itself, and you can see that we've got send and static. So send corresponds to the dynamic type, which I showed to you in the vSphere client just a moment ago. And let's see if we've got any additional parameters on get iSCSI HBA target. And I'm not sure if I'd shown this to you before. Minus question mark, that is the same thing as type in help before the name of a commandlet. And it will just show you the one-page summary. Yeah, we do have the ability to specify a type, an IP endpoint, and an iSCSI HBA adapter. So what I could do then is, if I type get vmhost HBA, and I can specify a type iSCSI, like so. And then if I pipe this to get iSCSI HBA target, then it will use only those specified iSCSI adapters as input to the iSCSI HBA target. So if you can imagine that you had multiple host servers and multiple iSCSI adapters, perhaps you have the built-in software iSCSI adapter, and you have an additional hardware iSCSI adapter, and you wanted to report on which of them is connected to what LUNs or what targets, then you might want to filter that out using techniques such as these. So let's just do t equals, and t is the same 4 that we specified before, because I only have the one iSCSI adapter on each server. Let's look at a couple of the other options here. We have type, target type. So what I could do then is, let's say get iSCSI HBA target type, and if I wanted to say static, I could, and it will show just those. So that's pretty easy to filter that out. Let's go back up to the top here. IP endpoint is the last. Now I have only the one iSCSI server in my environment, so it's not a specifically interesting example, but let's show it to you regardless. And that one actually didn't work. So I could try a couple different examples there. Yeah. Okay, so this is just if I look at the help for this parameter, we could do help get iSCSI HBA target parameter, and then IP endpoint. You can see here that does say specify address : port to filter the available iSCSI HBA targets. So that shows you several different ways on how to obtain a list of those iSCSI HBA targets. Let's look at how we can create new ones. So I've got my iSCSI adapters right here. Let's look at the parameters for new iSCSI HBA target. There are quite a few of them. iSCSI HBA, of course, that is the important one, which we're going to be using this $is variable as input here. And we know that this will work because pipeline is set to true. So let's look at some of the other parameters that I have available here. I've mentioned already address and port. and that's simply IP address and a port number. And then we have type. That's going to be an iSCSI HBA target type. Let's look at the help for this to get a clue on what that type is going to be. Okay, the valid values are static and send. So that corresponds with, I'm going to scroll up a little bit and look at the output here. So this corresponds to this right here. So what else do we have? We have iSCSI name, chap type, chap name, password, mutual, chap, inherit chap. And so again, I'm going to go back to the screen here in the vSphere client and show you that those correspond to these boxes right here. So we have the IP followed by the port and then the optional chap settings. So let's go ahead and create a new reference. I'm just going to do a fake one. It's not going to really do anything, but let's do IS, pipe that to new iSCSI HBA target, and we will say type send, and then we will say, scroll up a little bit, address and port, and a port is not required. It will default to using 3260 as I mentioned before. And you can see the output on the screen. It's created 1 and 2. So let's go back to the vSphere client. And you can see here, add internet SCSI send targets. And if I go back to the properties box under dynamic, sure enough, I see my extra one. And I had used send as the type of iSCSI HBA target. If I used static, then of course it would show up here. But if I did use static, then it would prompt me, it would want me to fill in this iSCSI name field when I specify that to the commandlet. So that's how you create a new iSCSI target connection. Let's go back to the slides. Moving on from iSCSI, now we're going to be working with things that are closer to the top layer. We're getting a little further in. We're going to be talking about disks, LUNs, and partitions. So let me bring up the vSphere client before I move any further. I always like to ground you in the settings related there. So let's go to, for example, this. So I'm back in the client of configuration storage adapters, and I've highlighted one of my SCSI adapters. Now, in my case, you may recall from our lab setup diagram that my servers are actually virtual servers. The ESX servers are VMs themselves. So that's why you see virtual machine chipset here. In your environment, you would more likely see something along the lines of perhaps an Adaptec array controller or something like that, talking about your local disks. That's what this is an example of. And then I've got an additional one here as well. Actually, that's my CD-ROM, and that's nothing. Okay, so here is one of my local disks, actually. And you can see here, we have several settings here, some of the attributes related to what describe the path to get to the disk. Those are using SCSI terminology. And I've got, for example, channel, target, and LUN ID. And LUN ID is 0. So I'm just kind of scrolling around here to show you some of the different settings that we're about to be playing with using PowerCLI. So first section, talking about these disks, LUNs, and paths, and so forth, we have the SCSI LUN commandlets. LUN, that is referring to logical unit number. So we have the get SCSI LUN commandlet. You can use that to retrieve SCSI devices available to a host, HBA, or data store. So it has some filtering options, which I'll show to you. We can use set SCSI LUN to modify an existing SCSI device, and you can change your multipath policy and preferred path. Multipath policy, this is, for example, on fiber channel, if you have multiple pieces of fiber and you want to determine how those two pieces of fiber are selected, which ones are going to be used, there's a couple of options there, and I'll explain those shortly. Get SCSI LUN path. This is going to retrieve available VM HBA paths, And this is important when you are working with your storage engineer in order to properly zone new storage. Sometimes you have to get some of the information from the vSphere server, and which is contained within this commandlet. So that's pretty helpful. And then set SCSI path. You can use this to activate or deactivate a path, and you can mark one as preferred or not preferred. So let's go back to our shell, and I will show you how these SCSI commandlets work. Okay, let's have a look at the different commandlets available. Just going to type get command SCSI. You can see the 4 here. Before I use get SCSI, let's have a look at some of its parameters. Okay, it has several. In fact, it has 1, 2, 3 different parameter sets. You can guess based on the name of them what they do. So we have the host parameter set, HBA parameter set, and data store parameter set. If you look a little more closely, you'll see that I've got a VM host parameter on this one, HBA on this one, and data store on this one. And each of them says pipeline true. So what this means is that you can filter the available SCSI based on the relationship to an object. So in this case, it's going to be the ESX server, it's going to be the host bus adapter. In this case, it's going to be a data store. So let's say, for example, let's look at my data stores. Okay, I've got one called OpenFiler, and that is the only one that I have in my lab, which is running over iSCSI. So let's do get SCSI. There we go, get SCSI LUN. And you can see what it's going to do is to show me only the path, only the SCSI LUN, which corresponds to the OpenFiler data store. Well, I can do it differently. I can also go through this method, go and get VM host. Let's say I just want to grab my second ESX server and then do get SCSI LUN. And then it's going to show me the ones there. Now I happen to know that I've intentionally misconfigured my second ESX server so that it doesn't have the iSCSI connection. If I look at my first ESX server, you can see it's got an additional disk. So this additional disk is the one that's going to be the most interesting because it's going to more closely mirror something that you might have in production, as opposed to the local disk device and the CD-ROM device. You can't really modify, for example, a multipath policy on a CD-ROM. That's not applicable. Before I show you how to modify that policy using the set SCSI LUN commandlet, I'm going to show you a little bit more about the details here in this path. Let's go back up. So I'm going to scroll back up to my output here. And let's see, data store parameter set. So I have the ability to filter further by canonical name, which is a SCSI terminology, and a key, a LUN type, and then cert. So key and LUN type and canonical name are common to all 3 of these parameter sets. So let's look at the output. When I did my get data store OpenFiler, pipe that to SCSI LUN, I've got a canonical name, device type, LUN type. So what if I wanted to, for example, retrieve only the disk types? So let's do this. I'm going to get VM host and just do it to all of them. And let's see, LUN type. And I don't know what the available LUN types are, so as always, I'm going to type in some bogus text, and PowerShell will tell me. And there's quite a few of them. Some of them are more commonly used than others, but if you have a look at these, you'll see that they're basically corresponding to the SCSI protocol, and these are all possible types of objects which you might be connected to over SCSI. So, I mean, worm drive, that's pretty old school. I don't even know what a couple of these things are. Media changer, that would probably correspond to a tape backup device, like a robot that's got multiple tape devices behind it. Printer, I had no clue that there was such a thing as a SCSI printer, but anyway, so the most applicable one to me in this particular instance is disk. So let's do LUN type of disk and see what I see. So that was pretty useful. So now it is filtered out. We don't see the CD-ROM output here. So what I want to do is go back to the example. I'm hitting up arrow a couple times, going to my open filer one. This is the iSCSI one. So I'm going to assign this to an object here. Let's call it SL. And then we will take SL and pipe it to format list and hit enter. Okay, lots of information here. Canonical name, runtime name. The runtime name and canonical name could be very useful to you in certain types of troubleshooting. For example, just off the top of my head, if you wanted to do a LUN mask, and this is an operation where you are going to hide portions of your fiber channel disks from some of your ESX systems. In order to do that, you do have to have this information right here. So this could be a great way to get that information by using the either get data store, get VM host, and piping it to get SCSI LUN, and that will give you this information here. Very useful. Another reason that this might come in handy is to find the name of the device, which is the storage device, which is related to. Maybe you want to get some statistics related to the performance of one of your fiber channel adapters. Well, the statistics, the key for those is going to be this device name right here. And I think we talked about VM host storage commandlet. Let me run this one real quick. No, it was get VM host HBA, in fact. Okay, yeah, so this one actually has some of the same information that we're talking about right now. You can see here the device ID, and I had mentioned that we've got some of the other information as well. SCSI LUN IDs and, well, driver was the other one I was looking for. But basically, I just wanted to show you that there are a couple of commandlets which return some similar information in cases. So let's go back up to our output here. We talked about LUN type and canonical name and runtime name. And these could be interesting here. Model, serial number, vendor. You might be able to get these to correspond to what's on your back end, whether perhaps you've got some HP disks or some EMC arrays or a NetApp iSCSI friend, what have you. You might see some of that information here. And this is going to depend on the feature set of the SCSI interface and several variables. You might not see useful information here at all. I've seen that in many cases in my own environment. Be that as it may. Console device name, this is going to basically show to you the console OS path for where this device sits. So we have /VMS/devices disks, and then you can see this canonical name, which is right here. Capacity MB and megabytes, of course, and then multipath policy, which we'll talk about in just a second, and a couple of other identifiers there. So let's have our SCSI LUN that we want to work with. So let's check out the set SCSI LUN commandlet, and we have some options such as multipath policy, preferred path, SCSI LUN, and a few different options here, some SCSI options. So the most interesting to me and pertinent right now is going to be multipath policy and preferred path. Now SCSI LUN, this is going to correspond directly to our SCSI LUN object, and you can pass it over the pipeline as you can see here. So one other additional thing I want to mention, let me look at the help for set SCSI LUN. And I wanted to mention that several of these parameters have they were changed by VMware. And you can see here under multipath policy, it says passing values to this parameter through a pipeline is deprecated and will be disabled in a future release. Same thing for preferred path. So if we scroll back up to my table here, you can see here where it says pipeline true on these two here. Basically, VMware turned that on, decided that it didn't make a whole lot of sense to use the parameters in that way. So perhaps in a future version of Power CLI, you're going to see that those are actually not, you can't specify on the pipeline. So I'm not going to show you an example of how to do it because it's weird and awkward. But I am going to show you how to pass the SCSI LUN on the pipeline. So let's do that right now. Clear the screen. SCSI LUN, pipe that to set. SCSI LUN. And I want to change the multipath policy, but I don't remember what they all are, so I'm going to do that. And PowerShell is going to spit out these enumeration values. They are as follows: fixed, most recently used, round robin, and unknown. Well, you can't specify unknown. Before I make this change, let me show you the before, which is here in the vSphere client. Somewhere, we'll go over, got an example right here. Okay, I found it. We're back on the storage tab. Go to devices view right here. And you can see this is on my first ESX server with the iSCSI connection. And once I click on this one, it shows me the information about the paths and the ability to click on the Manage Paths button. And this, in fact, is that setting. Most recently used, round robin, and fixed. And I could check some options there and click Change. Notice that we can now see the same thing that we were seeing in Power CLI, such as the runtime name and the LUN ID. So let me go back over to the console and we'll see what we can change. So let's change that multipath policy to, let's change it to round robin. So I'm going to copy that, paste that, and hit enter and see what it does. Shouldn't take but just a moment. And it is done. So let's go back over the console. You can see set logical unit policy. Let's go to manage paths. And sure enough, it is now set to round robin, as opposed to most recently used, which was the default in my case. So that is how you modify the multipath policy on your SCSI LUNs. There's another commandlet here, and that is SCSI LUN path. So let's type SCSI LUN path by itself, and it's asking for a SCSI LUN. And I do happen to have one right here. So we're going to pipe that to get SCSI LUN path. And that is showing me the SAN ID. So in this case, since it is an iSCSI SAN, I'll pipe this to format list. Okay, a bunch more information. Since it's an iSCSI SAN, we're seeing a little bit more information related to the iSCSI protocol. And that's this IQN number, for example. And there's some other information. Some of this is duplicated that I've seen in some other screens. If you have fiber channel, not iSCSI, it's going to look a little bit different. But suffice to say that there's some more information that we saw in the vSphere client just a moment ago. Now there is a corresponding set. So let's do this. We'll say SLP equals get SCSI LUN path. So what this allows me to do is to activate or deactivate a certain SCSI LUN path and make it preferred or not preferred. You go back over to my vSphere client. Now, in my case, this is iSCSI with a single port, an Ethernet port through which I'm connecting. Now, if you have a fiber channel SAN, then you're probably going to have multiple pieces of fiber, and usually two. You could have a different number, but two is very common. And you're going to have those two paths through which your storage traffic can go. You might want to have the traffic always go to a certain path by default, and you might want to also change whether, so for example, maybe you're doing some switch fabric maintenance, and you're going to want to make sure that all of your paths are set to the left side, for example, we'll call it, so that you can do maintenance on the right side. So that's definitely a case where you would want to use, let me go back to my console. You could very quickly and easily, using Power CLI, connect to every single one of your VM host servers, or perhaps you could do it by data store if you know the way that the LUNs are set up. But let's just say get VM host, pipe that to get SCSI LUN, pipe that to get SCSI LUN path. And if you wanted to, you'll have to do some filtering in here in order to make sure that you're getting the right piece of information out. But let's say that you had a device ID that you'd be able to fit in here, whatever LUN type, whatever, and we'll just say, that there's, let's say that this results in a match of 1 in your particular environment, and then pipe that to get SCSI LUN path, and then pipe that to get SCSI LUN, or rather set SCSI LUN path. Okay, and that will bring us to the point where I am right here, where I can say active or not active, preferred or not preferred. So using this very concise single line of PowerShell code, I could then go and active false. So that would deactivate a certain path. That would allow me to do the maintenance in my SAN fabric, and then I could come along and hit the up arrow, say active is true, and hit enter, and I'm done. I've switched the paths over on my entire vSphere environment in one line of PowerShell. So very powerful stuff. I'm not going to hit enter because I don't have multiple paths in my lab, so it's not really applicable in my case, but that's how you would do that. Let's go back to the slides. Okay, we are nearing the end of our journey from starting with the lowest level of the disks, and we're now up to the physical part. vmhost disk is the name of the noun for the commandlets. Got a few to talk about here. Get vmhost disk retrieves the disks available to a host, and this includes the physical disk geometry. So we're talking about cylinders, tracks, sectors, that sort of thing. Get vmhost disk partition. This is going to retrieve the logical disk partitions available to a host. Now we're talking about your C drive, your D drive. Of course, these are Linux servers, so it's actually not a C drive at all, but you know what I mean. Then we've got format vmhost disk partition, and this allows you to take a new partition that's available to an ESX server and format it using the VMFS partition type, which is the native one that comes with vSphere. So let's go straight into the demo. We're going to be working with the vmhost disk and vmhost disk partition commandlets. Okay. Okay, you can see the 3 here. Let's type in get vmhost disk by itself and hit enter. And there they all are. I'm not sure if you've noticed through the course of this particular video, some of the commandlets will make an assumption and return information about all of the vmhost's items, whether we're talking about disks or SCSI LUNs, but some of them won't. Some of them do require you to provide a vmhost object as input. Why VMware programmed the commandlets that way, I don't know. It isn't consistent. This is just something that you have to remember. Sometimes they will make that intuitive leap for you, and sometimes you do have to specify the vmhost object as input. Okay, so vmhost disk, and I've got some information here about my disks. And what I'm going to need to do is, let's say disk equals vmhost disk. Let's wait for that to finish. Okay, let's pipe that to format list. And now you can see what I mentioned to you before. Let me scroll up to the top. Cylinders, heads, sectors, total sectors. So this is the physical disk geometry of the disks in your host servers. And we also have the ability to correspond them back to the SCSI line. You can see that SCSI line property right there. And most of the rest of these are identifiers, which you're not going to be using in a practical way most of the time. Okay, that's about all there is on the Get vmhost disk. Let's look at the Get vmhost disk partition. First, let's look at the... I did want to show you one thing. You can also filter this by SCSI line. So let's say I have SL, my SCSI line. Pipe that to Get vmhost disk. Now I can get that disk information about that one LUN in particular. So it's always great to be able to use the shell to get that relationship, go back and forth. But let's look at Get vmhost disk partition. It has no options at all, just needs input of a disk. So luckily I have a few of them. So let's pipe that to that and see what we get. Okay. Now we're down to the logical disk partitions that are contained within a disk. So let me bring you back to the vSphere client to show you what we're talking about. We're still in storage, and you can see here, for example, this disk here. Okay, so this is a good example. This is one of the SCSI disks connected to this host server, and you can see that we've got multiple partition information here, and that is basically what we're talking about. If I go back to here, you can see some other information. There we go, it just refreshed. And this is the information about, let's go to properties, I'll show you even more. Okay, so now we can get the full view of these different partitions available to my disks. So let me go back to the shell and show you where we are with this. So let's do this. We'll say pt equals, okay, pt, pipe that to format list. This is going to be huge because I had a pretty long list, but I just wanted to show you some of the information that we've got in here. Partition number, logical, true, start sector, end sector, and type. So you did see the type field earlier. This is something that's particular to an ESXi system. That's the diagnostic partition. There's one last commandlet that I want to show you in this particular section, and that's format vmhost disk partition. Let's look at the help for it. Format a new VMFS file system on each of the specified host disk partitions. So I do not have a disk available with which to test this one, but basically what you can do, let me show you the example here real quick. You can see here where they are starting with get vmhost disk, and then go to vmhost disk partition and finding one of the partitions in that list and piping that to format and then giving it a new volume name. So that's an example of how you would use that. Let's go back to the slides. Okay, now we're going to be talking about data stores. And I'm glad, because this is the next to the last piece that we're going to be talking about in this lesson. And it's the one that makes the most sense in a sense. This is the part, let me bring my vSphere client. Data stores are a a full citizen, a high-level object, and this is something that you are exposed to and working with a lot in your vSphere client, all the time. And of course, the data stores, which I'm browsing through here as I'm talking, is basically the space upon which all of the virtual machine disks and your templates and everything else, that's where all of the data is it lands. So working with data stores, it's very, very common thing that you need to do. So it's going to be good to understand how to work with those using Power CLI, which is what we're going to be doing next. So there are a good set of data store commandlets, starting with get data store, and I'll show you what this how this works here shortly. New data store is used to create a new data store from scratch. Could be working with a local disk, a disk connected to a SAN or an NFS mount. You can use remove data store to get rid of one, and set data store to, well, basically all it does right at the moment is to modify the name of an existing data store. And I actually use that one quite a bit. Let's go back to the shell and I will show you what you can do with some data stores. Okay, first off, let's just type get data store and hit enter. Very quickly shows me some information about my data stores. Let me pipe that to format list. And we can see just a little more information. For example, we have the name of the data center, and we've got a parent folder ID because you can have your data stores in folders. And data store browser path. Some of these things are not extremely informative. Well, these are very informative. Free space MB and capacity MB. Of course, you've got to be very vigilant about watching the space that you have available in your data stores, and you can easily do that using Power CLI. And we've got type is VMFS. That's a VMware file system. If you are using NFS or a network file system mount, then you would see type of NFS there. So some of the things you can do with get data store, I like to be able to have the ability to show the relationships just like I can in the vSphere client. So let me go back to the vSphere client. Notice how if you've got a particular data store highlighted, you can go to, for example, virtual machines, and it will show you the list of those VMs on this particular data store. You click on hosts, and it will show you the hosts which are connected to that data store, and so on. Well, you can do the same thing using Power CLI. So let's say get data store, open filer 1, pipe that to get VM host, and that will show you that only one of my ESX servers is connected to this particular data store. And let's say that I wanted to get data store, open filer, and pipe that to get VM. And that'll show you just the virtual machines which are on a certain data store. Now this is a very practical thing that you might need to do. Let's say that you need to do some SAN maintenance and you want to be able to move a bunch of virtual machines from one data store to another so that your SAN engineer can clear some space up, or take something down in order to add some storage, or add a tray, or whatever the case may be. Well, now you can very easily say, here is the data store that I'm going to need to perform maintenance on, which are the VMs that are on it, and then let me go ahead and move them to another spot. So I can say get data store and data store 2. And if I hit enter, that'll go ahead and perform an SV motion and move those virtual machines wherever I want them to go. So pretty cool stuff, very easy to work with. Let's look at some of the other commandlets related to data stores real quick. And there they are. So what we're going to do now is have a look at how the new data store commandlet works. I'm just going to show you the help for it. And there's quite a bit in here. I wanted to show you some of the information here. Create a new data store based on the provided parameters. So let's look at some of the examples. And you can see here an example of connecting to an NFS host. There's not a whole lot to it. New data store minus NFS, VM host, and you do have to give it a name and then a path and then an NFS host. So there's several parameters to choose there, but a remote path is going to be a path related to the type of server in question. So since it's an NFS host, it's going to be forward slashes, for example, like this. So, and then the NFS host is going to be the IP address of the NFS host. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, now I want to show you something a little bit new, a little bit different. And this is not the same sort of thing that we've been working with. We've been working with commandlets, and now we're going to be talking about the data store provider, which is a little bit different. Let me show you the ability. You've probably worked with this before in the vSphere client, the ability to browse your data stores. And you can go through it. It looks very much like, for example, Windows Explorer, and you can do various things with the data here. You can even upload and download files. You can create directories and so on and so forth. So it's a file explorer. Well, you've got the ability to do something similar in PowerCLI. And first, I want to introduce to you something called the Vim providers. This is a PS provider. It's an interface to create a PS drive. And these are PowerShell concepts. The concept of a PS provider and a PS drive. These are PowerShell concepts. What VMware has done is provide a bit of software called a Vim provider, which acts as this interface. So a PS drive acts much like a Windows drive letter. For example, C:. That is a text-based, shell, hierarchical interface to your hard drive, right? Well, and you can then navigate them using commands such as cd or dir, which in PowerShell are aliases to set location and get child item, respectively. PowerCLI includes two providers. They are Vim Data Store and Vim Inventory. So the Vim Data Store provider is very similar to what I had just shown to you under the vSphere client browse data store. That is going to give me the same information, the Vim data store provider. Accordingly, Vim inventory is different. Let me go flash back over to the vSphere client. Vim inventory is basically a tree-based view of both my hosts and clusters and my VM and templates view. So it is in fact just a, well, I'll show it to you in just a moment. It's kind of hard to explain. Now, I told you that we've got providers and drives, and I'll give you a demonstration here in a minute so you know what I'm talking about. But when you connect to PowerCLI, these two providers exist, but they don't do anything. The way that you can interact with them are through the PS drives. When you connect, 4 PS drives are mapped or are created, and here are the names here: VI, VIS, VMstore, and VMstores. So VI and VIS, they're the same type of provider. They are the Vim inventory provider, but the difference is in the scope. So the VI drive is referencing the last connected VI server. So if you connect to multiple vCenter servers or multiple ESX servers, then only the most recent one is going to be found under VI. However, if you are connected to multiple servers, then you'll be able to find them all under VS. And in the same fashion, you've got the similar thing for VMstore and VMstores, except that these are using the Vim data store provider. So you're going to use VMstore to access to the files on your data stores, and you'll use VI to be able to read information about your inventory. Okay, let's go straight to the demonstration. Okay, first thing that I want to do is to show you the existence of these providers and these drives. There's a built-in commandlet called get ps provider, and you can see here the two that I've had mentioned, and there's a column here corresponding to drives. Rather than what I'm going to do here is get Vim provider, so that'll show me the ones I'm interested in. Let's do get PS drive. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, get PS drive, PS provider. Okay, so that shows me the scope of just the drives I'm interested in. So how do I get access to these? That is our question. So the way that you do it is using CD or set location, and then colon enter. So that's it. I've got a new drive, and it starts at the top level with your data center. So in this case, my data center is called basement. And by the way, tab completion works in these. And you can see here are my data stores. And now I'm reading information off of one of my iSCSI data stores. And here are the list of the virtual machines which I've got sitting on there. So let's cd app and go down, down, down. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, and there's some cool things you can do with it as well. One of the most useful things that I've personally done with the data store provider is have access to, well, let me show you here. So you can use the same commandlets in PowerShell that you work with your file system. Many of the same ones, not all of them, but many of them work the same way when you're accessing your data stores. Now, each of these files has more information on it. We've got a bunch of different properties. One of the most useful ones that I've found is the data store full path. And the reason is that this is sort of the special way that the vSphere API allows you to work with file names. And it's kind of like their way of showing, okay, where exactly is this file located. On a Windows machine, you're going to start with your drive letter, followed by a colon, and then the full path. In vSphere, instead of a drive letter, you have the name of the data store in square brackets, followed by a space, and then followed by the path. And of course, the path is going to be using forward slashes, not backslashes. So this information can be useful. For example, let's do. Going to have a look at some of my VMX files. Okay, so let's say that I've got this information here about this VMX file, and I wanted to have access to that data store full path value programmatically. So let's say that let's say VMX equals. So now the VMX variable has a data store full path property. Now, what can I do with that, you might ask? There is a commandlet which you could use to, for example, register a virtual machine. So let's look at new VM. We talked about this one a while back. It has a register VM option here, and one of its parameters is VM file path. If I do help new -VM VM parameter, and it doesn't show it here, but in the help examples it probably shows it. But this is actually expecting a file path in the format right here with your data store inside of square brackets, followed by a space, followed by the path to the VMX file. So what I was able to do in an instance was using the Vim provider. I went to an entire data store, and I did just a simple dir command, and let's see, recurse include an operation like that, and PowerShell came back with all of my VMX files. I was then able to programmatically extract the name of the data store full path, supply that to the new VM commandlet, and within a really short amount of time, I was able to register dozens of virtual machines, which for reasons I don't want to go into, had been unregistered from vCenter. So very useful interface to be able to do that. And there's another bit of it that I'm going to talk about here. Let me go back to the slides for a moment. there's another commandlet, copy data store item. Now the way that this commandlet is used to copy items, but you can either use it to copy items between data stores, or you can copy items between a data store and a local file system. Note that you have to use this commandlet instead of the built-in copy item commandlet. And I'll show you what it looks like here momentarily. It has a couple of important parameters such as item, destination, and recurse. And here's an example of how you would use it. Copy data store item, and then a local path followed by a remote path. So let's go to the shell and play with it just a little bit. So I'm in the app directory and I want to copy this file, let's say this app.vmx file. Your first instinct is going to be able to use the built-in PowerShell copy commandlet. And let's send that to my home directory. Now, I'm going to get an error message here in a moment. The source and destination path did not resolve to the same provider. So what we're looking at here is a limitation to providers in PowerShell. You can't copy between them. That's why VMware made the copy data store item commandlet. So let's try it. Copy data store item, and we'll say app.vmx, and then the same local path. And I hit enter. That's a small file. It shouldn't take too long. We saw a progress window. Let's cd back to C and dir star.vmx. I see a file. Let's try typing it. And what do you know? There's the virtual machine settings file for one of my virtual machines. So pretty cool to be able to copy that back and forth using a script such as PowerCLI. Let's go back to our slides. And that would be the end. Let's talk a bit about what we covered. First up was an overview of all the different pieces involved with your storage, starting with your storage subsystem and ending with the data stores. I gave you an overview of all the different types of commandlets and the range of nouns that we were going to be working with in this lesson. We worked with the vmhost storage commandlets and the storage subsystem. And I showed you how to configure iSCSI using the set vmhost HBA and the set vm host and the SCSI-LUN and the SCSI-LUN path commandlets. And that also gave us an input into working with the vmhost disk and vmhost disk partition commandlets. Getting towards the end, we talked about working with data stores, and I showed you how you can use the PowerShell pipeline to quickly show the relationship between data stores and virtual machines, or data stores and ESX servers. And then we went into the data store provider, and I showed you how you could access your files programmatically and copy files to and from your data stores.